Right, so for the tape, I should say this is the 8th of September, and I'm speaking to. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Bogusia Matusiak-Varley.
And we're going to be talking about particularly the Mary Morgan project that Dorothy did at Cape School in 1991. So, and I know that this subject matter gave you some concern at the start, and so the idea came from Dorothy, did it?
Yeah, the idea came from Dorothy because uh, I wanted to really get the children to understand the meaning of history on a sort of like social perspective, and we were discussing it, and then she went away and thought about it and came back with this idea of tombstones, gravestones, murder of a child, and and I was like, oh my God, where is this coming from? And I honestly thought it was going to be professional suicide for me, because I thought there is no way that I can get this across to a multicultural class whose English is not as good as it could, because obviously they were second language learners, and I was petrified, and she knew that. She knew that. In fact, she sort of like smiled quite sweetly. She said, "It's going to be all right." And, oh, okay, I shall go with this. But unbeknown to her, I went to my head teacher and I said, I really don't know what to do. I really don't know what to do about this, because I don't want any parental comeback or anything. And he just said to me, this is Dorothy, trust the process and let's get on with it. And that was absolutely brilliant, because what came out of it was learning that I haven't seen in years, literally in years, because the learning was so deep and the children were so interested. And as a context for learning, I would highly recommend, Mantle of the Expert, definitely.
And just to be clear, this was a year 8 class, am I right? These are
This was
no, sorry,
they're
8-year-olds.
eight
They were
years
8-year
old.
olds.
Yes, they're 8 year old. Yeah.
And your focus particularly was on reading. Was this the concern that you had? Because I think there were something like 8 children who couldn't
Who couldn't read.
read at
Yeah,
all.
yeah. Well, my focus was, let's get them interested in learning, because I really struggled with that class. I really, really struggled with them, and it doesn't matter sort of like where I wanted to take them, because I was very clear in terms of what I wanted to teach them, but they were they were a difficult class. It was difficult to engage them in learning. And when Dorothy came up with, we're going to be reading of tombstones, I thought, right, okay, let's go for this one.
Because somehow then she'd got hold of the idea of Mary Morgan, and this idea had grabbed her. This idea of the 2 gravestones that are
Yes.
on one grave.
Yeah. And I think she introduced very, very quickly the human element in history, that the human side of why do people do sometimes the things that they do, and that there is a reason behind it. And so those human bondings, particularly in penetrating this material, was very, very important for those children to be able to take their learning further.
Because the gravestones themselves, so they were dealing a lot of the time with texts, weren't they? The gravestones, the archival documents,
Yes.
but these were set up, or she tried to set them up in such a way that they would be accessible. So she used different ways, but still, this was challenging material, wasn't it?
Very challenging material. I mean, I had to read it twice. That's how challenging it was. So for children to actually penetrate the learning there, yes, it was challenging, definitely challenging. But I think what I learned as a teacher is that I actually put the limits on their learning, because in my mind it was, they'll never be able to do this. And I think sometimes as teachers, we do that. Oh, it's too difficult. Or what I hear a lot of on inspections is things like, oh, they can't do phonics. Phonics doesn't suit them, or they can't do this, or they can't do that. And it's us as teachers actually setting those ceilings, and it's wrong. And I was very lucky, because very early on in my career, having worked with Dorothy, I learned that children can penetrate anything. It just depends the way that you present it in a context that they can understand.
And they're motivated.
And they're motivated, and they struggle for the learning. Just struggling for the learning, because we talk about retention, and in the Ofsted framework, there's things like knowing more and remembering more. Well, you're not going to remember things if they come really easy to you. But if there's an emotional engagement and there's a struggle with that emotional engagement, you retain that learning. And this is what was happening throughout the Mary Morgan project.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing in Dorothy's work, that struggle, that sort of really struggling in your head to understand something, but wanting to understand it. And then, yes, the knowledge becomes your own. You own it.
And then understanding it with your prior learning experiences. And this whole concept of it, children are not an empty vessel. No, they're not. They're definitely not. But sometimes as teachers, we tend to think they are, or they don't know this, or they've never come across that. But they let them struggle for that learning. What is it? I can't remember. Is it Wallingham or Willingham who said something about desirable difficulty? That if there's an element of desirable difficulty, they will get through the struggle and they will make sense of what it is that they need to learn.
But there is that thing I found with a group recently, that I was a primary school group, and the teacher I was presenting them with materials about the Second World War. And she was saying, well, they haven't done the Second World War yet, and I don't know what they'll make of it. But eventually she let me just go with it, and they really took it on board, and she was so impressed by them. But there was that mentality of, they should be told about it first so they can deal with this. And yet if you put in front of them challenging material, and they will go for it. And
I think, as pedagogues, really looking at presenting information both ways, because there are some times where you do have to teach the learning objective, and you do have to teach the vocabulary, and you do have to identify what the knowledge is. But there are other times when just let them go and just see what they make of what it is that you present them with. And I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity to witness it firsthand with Just Let Them Go, because that was a defining moment in my teaching career.
So you carried on the project. Dorothy did a few sessions with them,
yes,
is that right? That's how it worked.
Yes.
So she set it up. She was working with some MEd students.
She was trying to get across to the MEd students how working with authentic materials is so very important for children to develop their understanding.
And then you carried it on, and you took the children to Prestine as well. And you talked to me earlier about the impact that it had on those children, how they were so into it in such a big way.
And I think this was inner city Birmingham. So going to a place like Prestine and actually seeing greenery was not something that was in their frame of reference. But we got to the graveyard, and they were exceptionally disappointed that Mary Morgan's grave was not clean. And they went up to the vicar and they gave him what for. And I had to apologise and say, excuse me, sorry about this, but they feel very strongly about it. And he was wonderful. He's absolutely, it's really wonderful that they should, feel so strongly about a gravestone. But, it was like, you really need to look after this. And some of them even bought some paper flowers with them. They'd made some flowers at home and some cards, and they wanted to put it on, on her grave to know that they were thinking about her. It's very touching, very, very touching. And then, of course, that led to other things, because as we walked around the graveyard, we counted how many people died in particular years. And, sometimes I say now, if you want to get kids interested, take them to a graveyard. But they loved it. They absolutely loved it. And this curiosity about, why did they die in peace? What does it mean to die in peace? So they were actually, because they'd been, they'd experienced reading from gravestones. So they went round reading all the gravestones in Prestine Church.
Yeah. And the whole business with the vicar was something, it's that thing about children taking on this sort of responsibility, becoming
citizens,
Yeah,
becoming citizens. Things matter. Things that happened in the past matter, and we should revere it, and we shouldn't just sweep it under the carpet, but let it live in lasting memory, which is what all history is about, surely.
Yeah. There's this thing we should talk about, I think, which is something that happened with Dorothy. She had this idea in her planning. We've got this on video where she talks about, this is such a gift, this idea. I'm going to ask them to be gravestones and to speak as gravestones. But when it came to it, and she talked about this herself, it kind of didn't work out as she planned, as she hoped. So maybe, and we can talk about this because she talked about it herself.
Yeah, it was Dorothy fell flat here. But in true Dorothy spirit, she took it in her stride, and it was a classic example of taking a risk. The risk didn't pay off too well, but at that time, in her sequence of what she wanted to do with the children, it was absolutely right. But what we didn't take into account, and something I should have told her, was that we'd actually never visited a graveyard. And because they were multicultural and they had different, sort of like rites and rituals in terms of funerals, they might not have been, well, they weren't the same as what it would have been when she said to them, and so what did you see in the graveyard? And every answer was nothing much. A classic piece of work that was.
Yeah, really... but you're right that she took the risk, and it seemed like a great idea to try it.
Absolutely.
And to do something very sort of theatrical, really, to ask them to stand and be gravestones and speak as gravestones.
Now that, and you know what, and that bit they could do. I couldn't get them to sit quietly in class, so when I was doing the sort of like formal curriculum, it was always sit up, pay attention, sit nicely, fold your arms, this, that and the other. But as gravestones, they stood there like sentry, they were brilliant. And then she went and she touched them and said, and what did the gravestones see in the graveyard? And one child said, nothing much. And then the echo started.
Yeah. And can you remember, was it something? It was mantle of the expert, it was the system that engaged them, but maybe there was something about this topic as well that engaged them.
It was the context, it was the way that she presented it, where she said that we are going to be detectives and we're going to try and solve a mystery. And obviously, they'd read the gravestones and the documents that she brought in. But for me, as a teacher at that time, I could not understand why it took so long to set up the place of work. And what I realise now is that through giving them such a very, very simple task, like arrange where you would be working as detectives, what she was doing was she was looking at how the children could take responsibility. So she was basically trying to ascertain the social health of the class. And I mentioned to you, earlier on that from the research that I did for my PhD, I'm developing this model for leadership. And one of the things that it makes me think about is how often in schools in particular do leaders throw tasks onto people with titles of leader, coordinator, head of department, assessment leader, or whatever have you. But they never really see the way these people work, or they never understand how, responsibility processes information. And if more of that was done, I think we would have less burnout in schools.
Because you said there were like, how many sessions? 2 or 3 sessions where they were just simply setting up their desks?
Oh, it was more than that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think there were about 4 sessions where they were designing, so what name tag would you have? What would be the logo of, of the detectives where you would be working? Who would be sitting next to you? All those things. Now, I'd have done that in 10 minutes. Right, okay, right, done, okay, off we go.
Yeah.
But it was that slowing down and developing that commitment to task because it was important. And she would actually use that as a behaviour management strategy, where if things got a little bit boisterous, it would be, would detectives really behave in that manner? And immediately we're back in role.
Yeah, because some teachers would look at it. In fact, I remember seeing a video of a staff meeting where there was a member of staff at the school who was saying, I love what you're doing, but as a teacher, I would feel very guilty about working this way because I'm thinking all the time about I've got to do the curriculum. I've got to cover the curriculum. But what she was doing was preparing them to engage with the curriculum.
And you'd cover the curriculum anyway because that level of engagement was so strong that they just wanted to do it.
Yeah.
So that building belief and that entry point to the curriculum was, certainly revolutionised my teaching.
You talked also to me earlier about the map, the work on creating the map of the village. So what do you remember about that?
Just the kind of jobs that people would do in that village. So where was the house where Mary Morgan lived? What was in the vicinity of the house? What were the jobs that people did there? So the children actually, that double perspective of keeping the as if world in their head in terms of what are the roles and the responsibilities of the people within the community.
Because they were creating their own imagined version of Prestine, weren't they?
And then actually seeing Prestine, they were thinking to themselves, well, where is the baker? Where is the the wine merchant? Where is this? Where is that? And it didn't quite add up with their model of what the fantasy had created.
Yeah, because that was really a choice. I've created a map on the website which has got it's a authentic map of Prestine with historic photos that you can click on and you can see what it was like in around about the time of like 1900. So that's a historic map. But her choice was to let them create the village as they wanted it to be because they would have the ownership over it.
Absolutely. And that would be their sense of belonging to a community.
Because they were citizens of Prestine in role, but also detectives.
So there was, the detective role was going on because we need to find out the information. And then on the other side, I hadn't worked like this before because I'm quite linear in the way that, that I do things. But she kept introducing these things and about, and as a citizen, you would be, living there, what would you see? What would you be doing? And they'd just be bringing out their own experience.
Yeah.
Which might not be historically correct, 9 times out of 10 it wasn't, but the emotional engagement was there. So then when they read the information in the archives, they had a schema on which they could hang the learning.
Yeah. Because it seemed to me that one of the things about this subject matter, which you were obviously naturally concerned about, there were things like at one point they designed their own gravestones, didn't they? And they put in things that it was bringing out things that they were in their sort of worldview and in their concerns. They're like, I think one gravestone said about the child was raped or something.
Right.
Things were coming
AIDS,
out.
Yeah.
Real things were coming out that usually in classrooms don't get aired in any way. So that's what the subject matter brought out and this approach. And I think that's, well, I don't know what you think, but I think actually we need to be talking to children about things that are in their heads, but we don't do it in schools.
They were bringing out things like rape, AIDS. That was another one that came out. And so clearly, they are exposed to all of this in the other world out of the classroom, but bringing it into the classroom really opened my eyes into how much exposure there is out there. And why am I protecting them? Because it's there, at least when they're working in drama or they're working in the classroom with the adults, we can help them, understand this. But out there's nobody there to explain it to them, but they hear it.
Yeah.
They hear about suicide, they hear about drug overdoses, they hear about AIDS, they hear about, suicide, all of those kind of things.
And you actually said, I think, that the parents were on board with it. Because your concern beforehand was that the parents might react negatively to it.
Well, they kept coming in and saying, "Who's Mary Morgan?" Are you still carrying on this work with Mary Morgan? This sounds really interesting. That's all they talk about when they come home, about Mary Morgan. And so, my relationship with the parents actually improved, because they were coming in and they were looking in the class in terms of what their work was, the way that they'd written up the gravestones and whatever have you. And I was able to say, just look at the use of language there, because they've got the conventions. Okay, the spelling might not have been 100%, but the actual convention, the grammatical structure of the sentences was all there. Why? Because they'd penetrated the archives and they read the gravestones.
Yes.
Now, I wouldn't have done that through my reading scheme, would I?
No. One of the things that Dorothy does is slow down time to give them time to look at things. And we don't do that really in schools,
I think as
do we?
teachers, we've just got to take it on board that, it isn't a false economy. It isn't, because what we try to do is we try to cover the curriculum. So they get to the end of the curriculum and they don't know anything, right? Whereas you can cover, inverted commas, I shouldn't use the word cover, but it should be learn the curriculum. But you can learn things, but you learn it at a much faster rate, because your mind is ready to absorb the actual content.
Yeah. One of the things that is kind of pivotal to the whole project was Dorothy's own role as the new vicar. Because that gave it this human thing, didn't it? That
Absolutely.
She was coming, they were the experts who could explain the town to her, and they also then were the people who would help her to understand this problem about Mary Morgan and why there's two gravestones. So that became the kind of human centre of it.
Totally. And the fact that they were empowered to tell an adult what they knew made it all the more absorbing for them, because they were the experts.
So what else do you remember about the project that stands out in your mind?
Exhaustion. Exhaustion in relation to preparing materials.
Yeah.
Because this is another very interesting thing about I used to do a lot of work with children through caricatures and photographs, etc. And one of the things that Dorothy taught me was, let it be as bland, let the visuals be as bland as they can be, so that the children can actually impose on this blandness their own understanding of what they think it is. And so I have now learnt that sometimes, obviously sometimes if you're doing dual coding and you're teaching new vocabulary, you've got to have the the picture and the word and whatever have you. But sometimes the less clutter there is, the deeper the learning will be, because the children can actually bring onto this imagery their prior learning, their prior experience, their prior knowledge of what it is that they're doing.
And I heard her saying today on one of the Mary Morgan videos, she was saying that, well, this material, I have not made it enchanting or beguiling, but it will become enchanting when they become obsessed with the material.
That's right.
She's deliberately not made it entertaining in that sense. They've got to get into it and then...
And this mythology of we've got to entertain children, because learning is hard. And there comes a time where you have to struggle with the learning and somehow we become entertainers, haven't we? We come into the classroom and they've got to be entertained. Oh, that's a lovely activity. Never mind about the learning, but the activity is lovely. And I see that on inspections time and time, particularly in early years, where I say to the teacher, what's the purpose of this activity and what are they actually learning? And some of the responses that I get, clearly demonstrate that it's a nice activity, but actually I've not really thought about what they need to learn through it.
Yeah. I was doing an online session about the Mary Morgan project the other day, and one of the people online said, how did it finish? Do you remember how it finished? Did it have a final point to it? Okay.
They're probably still researching it now. No, they learned that nothing finished. It would go on. So, for example, if I'd have them 2 years later, we'd make reference to some learning that. Do you remember when we did this, and do you remember when we did this in Rolling Roll? Do you remember when we did this in the Mary Morgan project? And that knowledge, once again, becomes part of their prior learning, and so they can carry on building their schemas for learning. So no, it didn't finish.
She was in Cape she did this. She also did work on Tudors and Stuarts.
Yes.
She did something on stables. I've seen videos of that.
Yes, it was the big explosion. Because we had the brewery across the road. So there's the Cape, well, not now, but the Cape Brewery was a big part of the community, and so there was this explosion in the brewery. So she sort of like brought history back onto the doorstep of the community where the pupils lived.
So the project that she did for a week in Clare Armstrong Mills School in Kings Norton, which was about the explosion in the boilers brewery. So you did that in Cape?
I took some elements from that and I used it in Cape, yes.
So all the stables videos are about that, the horses. Okay.
Yeah.
No, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and so they learned that, brewing beer now is very different to what it used to be, many, many years ago. So that was really living history.
Yeah. So was this work with different classes?
Yes, that was with a different class, yeah.
And so there was actually a lot of input at that time into the school from Dorothy, working with different teachers. So what was the response of the teachers in the school to the approach that she was taking?
Like most responses are, they absolutely loved it, but what they didn't like was all the work that has to go into preparing the materials.
Do you have an answer to that as a challenge to her way of working?
Yeah, I do, and I think the more that we can involve parents in learning, the more that we can actually say to, this is what we're doing. Have you got any, any magazines? Have you got any pictures? Have you got any of this? Have you got any of that? So that the parents can actually help us to to prepare those kind of documents, etc. But now with AI, we don't have to worry too much, do we? A lot of it is there. But the more I had parents in my classroom literally every day helping me with the resources, and they absolutely loved it because they could see how much children were gaining from it.
Because that's something that I actually really enjoy, because what you're doing is you're teaching through the materials. You're not the one who knows. You're creating the materials so that the children investigate it, and you and they together can investigate it. And I love creating those materials. I think that's a fun part of it.
Absolutely. But I do think that teachers need to know what is the knowledge that you want the pupils to learn. What is the knowledge? What is it that you want them to learn through this particular approach? And I think sometimes what happens is we carry on, and then I come along, in my role as officer inspector, and the first question I'll say to you is, what are they learning? And I need to be very, very clear that the sequencing, which is all to do with the internal coherence of what Dorothy does, that there is a logic to it and that there is an end point in relation to this is what they're going to learn.
Which is something that Dorothy herself insisted on.
Absolutely.
She talks about how drama teachers can be too vague about what they're teaching, and it should be pinpoint.
Yeah, just be clear in your head what you want. What's your outcome going to be? Because at the end of the day, you have got to carry on with your assessments and everything else. So if you're going to use it as part and parcel of your everyday teaching, you're not going to do away with what's the learning, what's the skill, what's the progression, what's the sequence, etc., etc. That still has to be there, but in a really creative form.
So it made a lot of difference to those kids.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I would recommend it to anybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for bringing back, the memories. Thank you.
Well, maybe we can talk again on a future date about the Tudors and Stuarts and other projects that you did with her. Can you just say, how did it all come together? Was it because Dorothy was doing a lot of work with the UCE, University of Central England, at that time?
I was actually a master's student at the time.
Okay. Because it was a great gift, really, wasn't it, to Cape School at that time?
Absolutely. And, you know, I mean, yeah, I was a student at the time, and you know, I asked her if she could, you know, come into school, obviously, you know, with the support of David Davis, to show in practice how it's actually done.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So all these are ways I have of reviewing the work. Am I catching it up? Am I giving enough time for this? Have I skimmed too fast here? There was an example in the Mary Morgan work with your class where I knew I was trying too quickly, but I reached for it in case. When we were in the cemetery, I asked the graves, the children were representing the graves, if they ever saw anything happen. I wanted to see if they wanted ghosts. And I got this classic remark, does much happen here around you? And the child said, not much. So I went to the next one. I knew
It started.
Went to the next one. When you are standing here in the cemetery, is there much, do the winds blow through? Not much.
30
And I got not much from every child. And it was a superb example of Heathcote landing herself. But you see, you can reach for something and see if it'll work.
Yeah.
But you can't say, oh, well, the first child says not much, so I'll stop it. I had to go systematically through to honour each child. And the sensible kids all said the same answer. Do you ever see any ghosts around here? Not much. Do any leaves ever blow around here? Not much. Nothing much happened. That's why the gate creaked. And it's a lovely example of too early going for a process of realisation, because I haven't done anything about the input. You can't speak as a gravestone if you don't understand what you represent. A lovely example. And, you know, you hit it every time.